And this year is celebrating Florida's historic coastal communities. My name is Nina Weber-Worth, and I am Vice Chair of the Board, and we're thankful to the Wilsonian FIU, our long-term cultural partner, for hosting this lecture at their wonderful institution. For those of you who are not yet members of MDPL, please visit our website, mdpl.org, to join. Members receive free walking tours, a gift shop discount, and our online newsletter. More importantly, your donations and member support our ongoing efforts to preserve, promote, and protect historic architecture on Miami Beach and beyond. Historic preservation is now in peril in the state of Florida, now dubbed the Tallahassee takeover of our local jurisdiction. This will override our National Historic Designation and open up our iconic Ocean Drive to development. We are working diligently to ensure that our preservation mission be sustained for the long term. Once again, thank you. And now here's Casey Stedman, Executive Director of the Wilsonian.
Thank you, Nina. Good morning. That was the other lecture. So some of you are seeing me for the second time. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Wilsonian. I want to welcome you on behalf of the entire team here. We work very closely with Miami Design Preservation League, one of our very close partners in so many things, not just Art Deco Weekend. And I encourage you to participate in their programs, do the walking tours, wonderful things, join. Now I'm going to shamelessly plug the Wilsonian. So I encourage you, the entire building is open. So all of our exhibitions on the upper floors, please take the time, visit them if you have the opportunity. We're entirely free today. If you're a Florida resident, we're always free for your visit. If you're a City of Miami Beach resident, sign up for your free membership as part of the funds that we're receiving as the Arts and Cultural Bond for the expansion of the museum. We now offer City of Miami Beach residents the equivalent of a family membership. So that's free admission always, which you have anyway, but it's a gift shop discount and Discover the Store. There's lots of wonderful things to buy there. As well as during the year, we invite you to special member only events and programming. So please do sign up. Wilsonian.org, join. If you get the Miami Beach magazine, there's an ad in the back with a QR code. You can grab it there too. So it's my privilege to introduce this speaker for this session of the lectures today, Anna Andrzejewski. Dr. Andrzejewski has been faculty member at the University of Wisconsin since 2000, and we were just talking about her perils of travel getting here in advance of the storms that are coming across the Midwest. Her research focuses on the vernacular buildings and the landscapes in North America, with an emphasis lately on post-World War II architecture. She's completed a book on post-war building industry and is currently completing a scholarly monograph about the cultural landscape of vacation and retirement South Florida between 1945 and 1970. Anna's work has been published in scholarly journals such as Building and Landscapes and the Florida Historical Quarterly. Her talk this afternoon will examine Florida House as a regional vernacular popularized in South Florida after World War II. So let's welcome Dr. Andrzejewski.
It is indeed a pleasure to escape the weather of the Midwest and come here. I'm extremely fortunate, and I want to thank the Miami Design and Preservation League as well as the Wilsonian for doing all that they can to bring me here. In March of 1960, House and Home, a trade magazine of the American building industry, published a special volume on the Florida boom. The cover depicts an aerial photograph of Coral Ridge, a subdivision built after World War II just north of Fort Lauderdale. It shows features that by this point were familiar across the southern half of the Sunshine State. Bulkheaded finger canals offered boat access to the Intercoastal Waterway and ultimately the Atlantic Ocean. Single-family homes line the human-made peninsulas and are interspersed with parks and swimming pools. The tagline, "What you can learn from the Florida boom," challenged the magazine's readers, builders and developers from all over the United States, to take lessons from this landscape for a broader national audience. The lead article was on the Florida house, which the magazine boldly proclaimed was a new kind of house. Popularized in just the last decade, the dwelling was, according to the editors, utterly different from earlier houses in the region and domestic architecture more broadly. They wrote that the Florida house, and I quote, was different in the way it works. It opens to the breeze, even when it also has air conditioning. It has no hard and fast boundary between indoors and outdoors, so the outdoors is much nearer and easier to enjoy. It puts screening over large parts of the outdoors, sometimes enclosing grass and sometimes trees, and sometimes swimming pools. It spreads a big roof for protection against hot sun and steamy rains. End quote. While House and Home's editors called out these physical features, it was not their novelty per se that made the Florida house so revolutionary. Rather, it was the lifestyle these features fostered. The Florida house, the editors argued, makes possible a free and leisurely way of life that marked a radical break with the past. The house type's potential even extended beyond Florida. The magazine stated, "Used anywhere, it will produce really exciting houses that fit their environment and change the way of life for the people who live in them." Today's paper explores the proliferation of the Florida house during the 2 decades after World War II. It considers the physical features associated with this purportedly regional house type, the factors that fed its popularity, and its significance in a national context. In a material sense, the Florida house comprised a loosely defined set of features, which included generous screened porches, Florida rooms, jalousie windows, concrete block construction, and carports, as well as a simplified open plan. Yet these features do not denote a fixed building type so much as they reflect a regionally distinct post-World War II manifestation of middle-class leisure. Builders and real estate developers seized on the perceived associations of the dwelling type's physical features with easy living to peddle Florida houses to non-Floridians for vacation and retirement. While they may have drawn inspiration from early 20th century luxury resorts, post-war builders and developers targeted a fresh market. Fed by post-war prosperity, this market consisted of middle-class residents with vacation benefits, as well as pension-laden retirees who could afford the time and money to vacation and retire in a tropical paradise. The triumph of the Florida house in the 20 years after World War II was a manifestation of this rising middle-class leisure market. Its success is measured by the fact that within a generation, both coasts of South Florida were transformed into a sprawling landscape of communities of Florida houses populated by middle-class vacationers and retired adults from across the United States. My talk today centers on the Florida house as a building type, which is different from the better-known architectural styles associated with the region. These styles, which you all know well, included these found in the Art Deco district of Miami Beach. That's not to say that there's no relationship between the Florida house type and these popular architectural styles. Indeed, as we'll see, many builders of so-called Florida houses looked to design features pioneered by Florida architects such as Robert Law Weed, Paul Rudolph, and Igor Polevitzky as inspiration. Yet what House and Home magazine labeled as the Florida house was a vernacular house type. This form of popular housing stood apart from the more well-known custom dwellings associated with regional modern architects. Created largely by merchant builders and real estate developers, the Florida house was mass-produced for a non-Floridian market, mainly second home buyers and retired adults. Architects were sometimes involved in the creation of model houses, but they were typically not the big names associated with signature houses and progressive architectural styles celebrated today. While the Florida house was produced by merchant builders and developers, its popularity after World War II was utterly dependent on a growing vacation and retirement market in the Sunshine State. State officials courted the tourist dollar, creating agencies such as the State Advertising Commission and the Retirement Research Division in the late 1940s specifically to attract transplants. Colorful brochures like this touted Florida as a leisure destination, replete with tantalizing photos of leisure seekers taking in South Florida's offerings, including its beaches, wildlife, and roadside attractions. Kowtowing to a rapidly growing market of oldsters was a particular focus of state boosterism. The thinking held that with employee-sponsored pensions and Social Security benefits, pensioners could provide a boon to the state's coffers. The state incentivized builders and developers to devise affordable and practical houses and communities suited to this new clientele. With vacation and retirement benefits reaching broader segments of the middle class during the post-war period, the market for leisure had grown far beyond the wealthy patrons that had come to places like Miami Beach earlier in the 20th century. And with this, a new leisure landscape, one quintessentially middle class and suburban, took root. Looking at the building block of these communities, that is the Florida House, helps us see the post-war Florida boom less as a result of the state's desirable climate, although it is, of course, that, and more as the result of multiple interests coming together to shape a landscape of tropically inspired leisure, one that continues to inspire out-of-state residents to flock to Florida today. The post-war success of the Florida House was built partly on early 20th century conceptions of Florida as America's tropical oasis. In Miami Beach, Carl Fisher built luxury hotels in the 19-teens and 20s to lure affluent tourists southward, hoping they would buy into one of his subdivisions. Fisher and other entrepreneurs devised gimmicks to delight their guests, including gondola rides and elephant caddies that fueled the images of the barrier island as an exotic winter playground. Miami Beach's first resort hotels were built in revival styles, such as the Mediterranean Revival and Spanish Colonial. Alan Schulman has characterized these revival styles as comprising of fabricated tropicality, an idea that acknowledges the ways in which entrepreneurs cultivated an aura of tropical otherness to attract visitors. While the Florida boom was collapsed just prior to the Great Depression, halted luxury resorts and leisure development, the idea of Florida as a tropical oasis was not lost. The state's sponsorship of the Florida Tropical Home at the 1933 Century of Progress International Exposition in Chicago fueled interest in the state and its reputation as a tropical paradise. Designed by Miami-based architect Robert Long Weed with support of Paste & Stewart, the Florida Tropical Home was one of 13 modern houses put forth by the Home and Industrial Arts Group as innovative models for the future. Weed and Paste & Stewart were selected because of their reputation as designers of some of the most notable houses in Miami Beach, Coral Gables, Coconut Grove, and Hollywood. And in keeping with the fair's theme to showcase modern progress and offer an uplifting vision for the future, the Florida House offered a blueprint for modern living suited to the semi-tropical conditions of its peninsular location. In a pamphlet about the house, we described its motivation deriving from the unusual climatic conditions of southern Florida. The choice of concrete as the principal building material, readily available and functional in Florida because of the lack of freeze-thaw cycles, offered vital protection against tropical storms as well as nasty insects. Large windows, meanwhile, embraced more pleasing aspects of Florida's climate, in particular the extensive sunlight and tropical breezes. As Weed explained it, quote, "Windows are plentiful and so placed that constant trade winds of southern Florida may reach all parts of the house." Such windows permitted views out of the house as well, enabling the tropical house's occupants to experience views of semi-tropical nature. We'd planned the entire house around the idea of letting the indoors out and the outdoors in. On the first floor, the bottom of the plan, a loggia spanned the length of the living room. The second floor, meanwhile, was almost entirely made up of outdoor living spaces. Weed's plan allowed for outdoor living areas to wrap around the upper floor of the living room in a U shape and included a sun deck, a living deck for dining, and a recreation deck, the largest of the three spaces. Arts and Decoration magazine described this feature as the most striking innovation of the house, where one could, and I quote, "lounge, dine, or play games with only the blue sky and the stars, and perhaps an awning overhead," end quote. The magazine hailed the Florida Tropical Home as, and I quote again, "a Florida manifesto, its own version of a modern house adapted to the Florida climate and to conditions of resort life. The editors also labeled it as a death blow to what they called the gingerbread and fake Spanish that had marked much of the 1920s building boom in places like Miami Beach. The sleekly designed pink model house was originally surrounded by tropical foliage to emphasize its exotic appeal, as well as justify the amount of area given over to porches and decks. On the interior, meanwhile, a cool color scheme, white walls with blue and green trim, designed to mimic the colors of the sea, was planned to help the interior blend with the tropical setting and a life spent out of doors. Architectural historian Vandana Baweja has contended that Weed's model house inaugurated the proposition of a regional architecture for modern Florida. Baweja convincingly shows that these ideas embodied in the Florida tropical home motivated a generation of Florida architects to bring together tropical associations of the region with international modernism. Of course, we have to recognize tropical is not based on the geographical tropics, defined as a zone between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, but rather what Alan Schulman describes as that fabricated tropicality. Thus, houses built in Florida, in the wake of Weed's example, derive not from actual tropical houses, but rather on a set of imaginary ideas about Florida as a tropical paradise. After World War II, progressive architects in Florida drew on Weed's example to create a regionalist version of modern design. Paul Rudolph became the figurehead for the Sarasota School on Florida's central west coast. Along with partner Ralph Twitchell, Rudolph created houses with open floor plans that embraced sea, sunshine, and Gulf breezes. In Miami, proponents of post-war Miami modern style forged a similar kind of design aesthetic rooted in South Florida's climate. One of these was Weed himself, who worked alongside others focusing on domestic architecture in South Florida, including Rufus Nims and Igor Polevitzky. Polevitzky's Birdcage House, the second Michael Heller house completed in 1949 on the Venetian Causeway, illustrates the movement's aspiration to embrace the outdoors. The entire wood-framed dwelling was encased in a lumite screen, which earned the house its moniker as well as praise from Life magazine. The editors wrote, "Two-thirds of the house actually is outdoors, exposed to sun and rain, walled and partly roofed simply by plastic screening on a timber frame. In this bird cage is a swimming pool, an upper living deck, and even a healthy growing busita tree. In their cage, the Hellers live an idyllic subtropical life, sun-drenched, windswept, and insect-free." According to Architectural Forum, the dwelling inverted the usual relationship of house to porch. Instead of concealing the patio within the house, wrote the editors, it conceals the house within a two-story patio. Although post-war merchant builders and real estate developers would have been familiar with the work of these and other progressive architects, the dwellings they marketed as Florida houses after World War II bear little resemblance to these high-style examples. Part of this was simply the fact that builders and developers catered to a middle-class market. To keep costs low, house footprints were conventional, rectangular boxes, exhibiting little, if any, experimentation with H and U-shaped plans, marking progressive architectural design. Moreover, the bleed between interior and exterior is not as pronounced in vernacular examples, as we'll see, as it was within the architect-designed dwellings. The only areas of overlap lie in a preponderance of spaces devoted to outdoor living, a general fad exhibited in post-World War II housing, and in the vague notion of tropical living. So rather than build after examples of Polevitzky, Weed, or Rudolph on the cheap, builders and developers forged the Florida house type to satisfy a booming demand for small, affordable, middle-class suburban houses after World War II. The post-war housing boom is often associated with returning war veterans who, with the benefits of the GI Bill, were able to purchase modest single-family houses in large subdivisions on the urban fringe. Calling these communities of small houses built in the 1940s and 1950s GI towns, however, oversimplifies the market they served. 2 decades of economic depression and war had created pent-up demand for housing in general. More Americans, not just veterans, had money to spend on housing after the war, but found little available to buy. Entrepreneurial builders and developers sought to fill this gap, creating vast suburbs on the edges of major cities. The most famous, of course, being the Levitt brothers, who built the massive, and dare I say, infamous Levittowns in New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. In Miami, the equivalent of the Levitts were the three Mackle brothers, Robert, Elliot, and Frank Jr., whose firm, the Mackle Company, was the largest in the state in terms of volume. After sustaining their business on federal contracts during the war years, the Mackle's fortunes grew rapidly after World War II with a series of large housing projects in the Miami area. Initially, the Mackle Company specialized in what Elaine Stiles has identified as economy housing, defined as homes within the financial reach of the nation's lower middle or working class. In the early 1950s, the Mackles advertised a 584 square foot dwelling intended for this market, promoting it as the nation's best buy. Designed by Miami architect Edward T. Rempe, this concrete block model contained two modestly sized bedrooms, a living room, a small kitchen, and a small bathroom. And while Spartan, these kinds of houses proliferated in mass-produced subdivisions across the county, that is Miami-Dade County, in the early 1950s. Although the Mackle Company built larger houses, including 3- and 4-bedroom models, and even custom dwellings in some of their developments, the company grew its bottom line by selling small 2-bedroom houses like these in the Miami area. Yet by 1955, demand for economy housing had stagnated, as numbers of veterans seeking homes had shrunk significantly. And this prompted the Mackles to shift their target market from veterans to leisure seekers, which also meant pivoting to a national market. The firm's market research revealed that demand was growing. In October of 1954, the Mackle Company reported on a survey of 3,000 inquiries received for their Broward County development of Pompano Beach Highlands. The findings revealed the most interest from Illinois, 451 inquiries, followed by more Midwestern states and states in the Northeast, dare I say, the snow-laden places. Inquiries, in fact, came from each of the 50 states, including California, as well as from Canada. Another inquiry reported in December of 1954 came from a citizen in France. The Mackles claimed they were at a loss in terms of how the Frenchmen knew about their business. Given this growing interest amongst out-of-state audiences, the Mackle Company completely changed up its marketing plan. In the fall of 1954, the firm promoted their economy houses in Pompano Beach Highlands exclusively to local audiences, boasting that the houses represented the greatest home values offered in Florida. But just a few months later, the Mackle Company advertised the same homes nationally. The company ran ads in Life magazine, as well as in the Chicago Tribune and the Boston Globe. Despite the floor plans and prices being nearly identical, the sales pitch had been transformed. The Mackles now foregrounded the idea of the Florida home, nomenclature that the firm and others adapted to peddle its houses to clients outside of Florida. The ad reads, "Living at its best begins in retirement," and touts the benefit of a Mackle-built Florida home in resort areas in the Sunshine State. When these initial marketing efforts proved profitable, the Mackle Company developed a multi-million-dollar annual advertising campaign. Beyond print advertisements, it included hiring a team of salesmen, operating branch offices in northeastern and midwestern cities, staging model home displays outside of Florida, and coordinating all expense-paid trips to their Florida communities. Features of the Mackle Company's Florida houses were strikingly consistent across the numerous developments the firm built on the east and west coasts of South Florida during the 1950s and 60s. The dwellings were built of concrete block on slab, making them inexpensive and suitable for Florida's tropical climate. 1 story in height, the houses were modest in size, rarely more than 2 bedrooms and never more than 3, ideal for the vacationing family, the retired couple, or a single person. Most were rectangular boxes, sometimes exhibiting an L-shaped wing or modest porch extension. These dwellings also included features that gestured to the tropical environment. They often included jalousie windows, screened porches, and rooms with banks of windows designed to bring the outdoors in. While minimally ornamented, decorative features drew on tropes associated with the tropics, sometimes rather far away. This is perhaps most extreme in Marco Island. Here, the Mackle architect, Herb Savage, developed housing models inspired by a Polynesian theme, showing that authenticity often took a back seat to a more generalized tropicality. The Mackles frequently included Florida rooms in their appeal to northern audiences. According to a 1953 article in the New York Times Magazine, Florida rooms were invented during the 1950s building boom. The newspaper defined the feature as a space in which the outdoors and indoors meet, which were being incorporated into many modern houses rising here by the score. Still, what constituted a Florida room is somewhat ambiguous. A late 1950s brochure for Mackle's Port Charlotte community showcased Florida rooms in their higher-end models. So in the Biscayne Harbor, the Florida room was incorporated into the body of the house with window walls. Other builders, meanwhile, called any porch a Florida room, signaling the faddish nature of the term to contemporary audiences. By 1958, House and Home magazine reported on the migration of the feature northward to a home in Fort Wayne, Indiana, with a large screened-in area between the family and living room. As the Mackles publicized their houses to a national market during the 1950s, they played up features like Florida rooms to position their houses within a tropicalized context. This is especially apparent in a series of model houses the company built in northern cities during the winter of 1959 and 60. One of these debuted on the 7th floor of Mandel Brothers department store in downtown Chicago in January of 1960. While the Floridian model compared with suburban houses in the Chicago area with its one-story height and modern styling, it also stood apart. It looked different with its jalousie windows, concrete block construction, and large Florida room. The model house was also painted with bright colors, yellow, blue, and green, filled with tropical-style furniture that Mandel's also sold, and decorated inside and out with lush tropical plants to evoke a life of sea and sunshine. The model Florida house, in other words, performed tropicality for its upper Midwestern audiences, invoking a kind of otherness rooted in region that was designed to coax Northerners into the allure of a relaxed tropical lifestyle. Another Mackle model home opened a month earlier in the basement of Grand Central Station in New York City. Whereas the Chicago model house's location in a department store would have appealed to middle-class female consumers, the New York model targeted a different kind of client, the middle-class commuting businessmen, who would have encountered the 1,300 square foot model dwelling as part of their daily commute. A tropical Florida house, the one-story concrete block model, was also outfitted with tropical plants and furniture, signifying a tropical life of leisure that would have stood apart from the workday routines of passers-by. Mackle salesmen stood ready to sign up clients interested in a house or a lot in one of their Florida developments. To amplify the idea of tropical leisure, the Mackles hired someone to tend the house. Former Miss Florida, Sandy Worth, watered the tropical plants and cleaned the jalousies, sometimes waving to passers-by on their daily grind. Such gimmicks vaulted the Mackle brothers to national prominence. By 1960, the Mackle Company was the largest home builder in the country. Their specialization in Florida houses was, of course, key to their success. And yet, as I've suggested, much of this was about marketing, not a clear set of physical features. The Mackle's success was predicated largely to the degree in which the Mackles melded the middle-class single-family house with long-standing notions of tropical, easy living associated with life in coastal South Florida. This formula held great appeal to a rapidly growing middle class with growing time and more substantial means to vacation and retire during the post-war years. While the Mackles were the largest building firm in post-war Florida, they were joined by other smaller builders and developers whose work suggests the myriad ways in which the Florida house was bound with post-war ideas of leisure living. One such builder was Frank Volanti, who founded Florida Sundeck Homes just after the war. Volanti's model house, another Floridian model, was honored by American Home Magazine as a best buy for the money in September of 1957. Built of concrete, the one-story dwelling contained 864 square feet of living area, which encompassed a living room, kitchen dining area, tile bathroom, large sunroom and patio, single bedroom, and carport. It featured jalousie windows and sliding glass doors, once again to embrace the sunlight and coastal breezes. It had wide overhanging eaves to thwart torrential South Florida downpours and hurricane-proof poured concrete construction. At $9,745, roughly $100K in today's terms, it was on the low end of Volanti's range of 1-, 2-, and 3-bedroom houses, which he had been building for about a decade in the Miami area. The Floridian was one of several featured in Leisure City, which was designed to appeal to out-of-state leisure seekers. Volanti began developing Leisure City near Homestead in the early 1950s, marketing his homes with a particular focus on a growing market amongst out-of-state, pension-laden retired adults. Volanti built his houses of poured concrete, making them termite-proof and hurricane-proof, a strategy that would have appealed to Northerners concerned about potential challenges of living in South Florida's temperate tropical climate. He also built with a focus on bringing the outdoors in a novel way. The houses contained roof decks that residents could use to cultivate outdoor living, sometimes also a pool on their deck. Volanti ultimately switched to the more faddish and practical Florida rooms to embrace outdoor living, but his sundeck homes that he created suggest the extremes to which builders would go to try to appeal to an out-of-state leisure market. This post-war middle-class market for leisure, while partly a product of the booming post-war economy, was also supported by a dramatic expansion of vacation and pension benefits to a broader swath of consumers, which included the middle class as well as segments of the working class. The expansion of salaried work meant vacation benefits extended to a much larger number of Americans previously paid by the hour. Employer-funded pensions, meanwhile, helped greater numbers of Americans retire and enjoy monthly fixed income benefits, as opposed to just scraping by. And by the 1950s, the first payouts of the 1930 Social Security program reached older Americans. All of this meant that they could partake of leisure time in Florida or elsewhere for vacation and retirement. The creation of long-term amortized mortgages also meant more people than ever could purchase single-family homes, fueling the relationship between single-family home ownership and a post-war idea of the American dream, whether in vacation as a second home or in retirement. Florida was among a handful of states that aggressively courted the expanding leisure market in the post-war period, particularly the retirement sector. In October of 1950, Governor Fuller Warren issued a proclamation to make Florida, and I quote, a haven for old folks, capitalizing on the nationwide expansion of pension plans. In a press release, Warren stated, and I quote, it's a little bit long, "The pension movement has great significance for Florida. Our state has long been a mecca for persons retiring. Within the next 10 years, however, the number of those able to retire and come here will jump by tens, even hundreds of thousands. We can make Florida the home and haven of old folks. We can do it by helping them with their housing problems, by providing recreation for them, and by showing them how Florida can better serve their needs than any other state in the Union," end quote. Governor Warren established a retirement research division within the state's Development Bureau to develop a model retirement village designed to cater to a growing retirement market. As Walter Keyes, director of the division, explained, the neighborhood village revolved around a single-family suburban dwelling. As he described it, and I quote, "Homes will have front yards and backyards so residents can raise chickens and grow gardens," end quote. Such houses would be built in communities developed on inexpensive land, well removed from cities, making them affordable for the fixed income recipient. As Keyes explained it, and I quote again, "The governor is endeavoring to protect the citizens of Florida with his plan. Development of these villages would prevent these people from becoming dependent on state welfare." So keeping costs low was very deliberate. Leisure City was the first community built after the state's neighborhood village model. Volante constructed the first houses there as one-bedroom units, which were intended for a single person or retired couple. The builder quickly realized that most people wanted larger houses, dare I say a guest room, but he remained committed to building economy houses on a pensioner's budget, following the state's recommendations. As a model neighborhood village, Leisure City was designed to be self-sufficient, with stores and amenities within its boundaries, operating at what Keyes called as a satellite city. Model neighborhood villages like Leisure City were sufficiently protected from surrounding communities to provide what he called quaint and congeniality of atmosphere. So much like any suburban community then, neighborhood villages like Leisure City provided community. Yet at the same time, it functioned very differently from a typical suburb. Given that many of its residents were retired, it meant that they didn't commute. Instead, they spent most of their days engaged in leisure pursuits there, such as swimming and shuffleboard, rarely leaving the boundaries of the community itself. While the state incentivized building these sorts of developments for pensioners, this was certainly not to the exclusion of the tourist market, including vacationers and second home buyers. And as noted at the beginning of this talk, Florida also actively promoted itself during the period as all-year vacation land through its state advertising bureau, courting middle-class tourists replete with newly found paid vacation benefits. Note that the state called these model communities like Leisure City neighborhood villages and not retirement villages. They were not planned originally to be age restricted to 55-plus members. The 55-plus communities we know today were actually invented in the 1960s. Populations of places like Leisure City may have skewed older, but these developments welcomed a combination of middling families, seasonal visitors, and retirees to live there. Builders and developers worked in concert with these and other state efforts to woo leisure seekers after World War II to Florida, adapting their small houses for an out-of-state market that desired easy living in vacation and retirement. As I already mentioned, much of this related to promotion. The Mackles rebranded their small, lower-income houses as Florida houses without altering the basic form of the dwellings originally designed for veterans. The biggest shift came at the level of community design, as builders and developers increasingly pandered to leisure seekers from northern states. Shuffleboard courts, recreation centers, swimming pools, fishing docks, and boat basins were erected adjacent to, or sometimes instead of, schools and playgrounds. In a few instances, builders reworked features in the houses themselves to enhance easy living, beyond the incorporation or rebranding of porches as Florida rooms. One such builder was James Rosati Sr., a St. Petersburg home builder. Like Volante and the Mackles, Rosati got his start building small, low-cost veterans' houses after World War II. He did so by enlisting mass production techniques learned during the war, working alongside Fred Trump and the Levitt brothers on Long Island. By 1955, Rosati had pivoted to the retirement market, and as he did so, he changed up aspects of his subdivision planning. Rosati platted smaller lots for ease of maintenance and built his subdivisions with recreation centers for his older clients to enjoy. Orange Lake Village, Rosati's first dedicated retirement subdivision, was singled out in an NBC-BBC feature in April of 1957, A Generation of Elders, as the solution for retirement housing. Explaining the formula, Rosati told the host, John Chancellor, that his easy living formula for his residents was simple. It involved buying up cheap land, subdividing it into small residential lots, building modest, easy-to-care-for houses, and incorporating recreational amenities into the development. When Chancellor commented, "I don't know why more builders haven't done what you've done," Rosati responded, There'll be builders all over the country doing this. Prophetic, given that these ideas were shortly taken up by Del Webb in Sun City and Ross Cortese at Leisure World in the first 55-plus age-restricted communities. Post-World War II period, it was Rosati, along with the Mackles, Volanti, and other enterprising Florida builders who churned out Florida houses for leisure communities that were partially, but not exclusively, targeting older adults. And while amenities such as beaches, recreation centers, and shuffleboard courts are features of easy living associated with Florida vacation and retirement communities, Rosati also tried to scale down the idea of easy living to the houses themselves. In 1959, in conjunction with notable rehabilitation medicine physician Howard Rusk of NYU, Rosati pioneered the Horizon Home that was designed to make life easier for older residents. Dr. Rusk envisioned the house as a solution for patients with physical disabilities, particularly those in wheelchairs, and worked with Rosati to design the model dwelling, which he dubbed the functional home. Rosati, meanwhile, had a different target: the pension-laden retired adult. The home seen here served both audiences. Its lack of thresholds, no skid flooring prevented falling. It had grab bars in the shower and outlets and shelves within easy reach. As Dr. Rusk hailed Rosati's design as a beacon for adults with disabilities, the physician also recognized that Rosati's model dwelling could prove more functional for the efficient and so-called able-bodied as well. Or as the ad boasted, it was functional for everyone. Rosati subsequently marketed the Horizon Home as part of his developments, Skyview and Florida Retirement Village, in the late 1950s and early 1960s. One such brochure seen here featured it as part of the royal family of homes. So alongside the Duke, the Duchess, the Count, and the Viscount, the Horizon Home was part of Rosati's suite of Florida houses. In his marketing for Florida Retirement Village, Rosati extended Florida living beyond the individual Florida home, explaining how the way of life one led in his development involved other retirees with whom one could shop, play shuffleboard, or enjoy an art class. Rosati's campaign suggests that the Florida house was as much an ideological construct as a building type, standing in for easy living Florida style. To argue that marketing the Florida house and its associated lifestyle succeeded is an understatement. In 1958 alone, Mackle had over 2,500 home starts, while also selling 40,000 lots for future residential development on the $10 down, $10 a month installment plan. The Florida House by the Mackle Company and other builders was the building block of South Florida's second boom, a variant of the suburban houses that marked the post-middle class suburbs everywhere. The kinship of the Florida house with suburban houses in general, everywhere in America, is actually key to understanding its popularity. For white suburbanites, the type was familiar, just juiced up with a tropical twist, so that it was easy to imagine buying a second vacation home or a retirement abode somewhat like it. For others, the Florida house was aspirational, the type of easy living embodied in the house made possible by the Mackles and others' efforts to design houses for those on a modest fixed income budget. Thus, even if one had paid rent during their working years, the Florida house made the American dream of home ownership possible in retirement. Of course, the Florida houses like these, actually, were not available to everyone. The house type was one and the same with middle-class whiteness in the post-war period. While racially restrictive covenants were outlawed in 1948 under Shelley versus Kramer, restrictive lending practices endorsed by the Federal Housing Administration persisted in the period in Florida and elsewhere, limiting the ability of Black and brown Americans to purchase houses. Moreover, few people of color were as of yet receiving generous vacation and pension benefits. Most were still paid hourly. The fact the Florida house type was bound by race and class is significant in explaining the fact that during the 20 years after World War II, Miami was the most segregated metropolitan area in the country, as numerous studies showed. As white snowbirds and transplants bought up Florida houses and developments along the coasts and southern parts of Dade County, Black and brown Miamians were crowded into Overton and northwestern parts of the county, as the late urban historian Raymond Moll and others have discussed. So what exactly is a Florida house? This is what I've been asking myself for years. As I've argued today, in the 20 years after World War II, the house type was less a bounded set of architectural features than an idea, often aspirational, associated with easy living Florida style. To return to the house and home essay discussed at the beginning of my talk, the Florida house had the potential to make possible a free and leisurely way of life. A final pair of ads for Florida houses illustrates how fluid the notion of a Florida house could be. An ad for yet another Floridian model home, the third I've shown today, by a group of developers behind Fort Lauderdale Estates on the left, shares many features with Mackle's Floridian model. One-story height, concrete block construction, jalousies, two-bedroom size, carport, and a Florida room. The ad on the right, meanwhile, for real Florida houses from Rosati mentions none of these features. Instead, Rosati's houses featured full-grown citrus trees on every lot, a strategy Rosati used to market his houses to clients in his numerous St. Petersburg area developments. And in other ads, Rosati listed features seen in Florida homes by other builders, some of the things I already mentioned, concrete construction, etc. But at Orange Hill Estates, the Florida house depended on those citrus trees as well as water views, as other ads boasted. The fluidity of the concept of the Florida house served its builders well. It allowed the Mackles to rebrand their veterans' houses at Pompano Beach Highlands as Florida houses. It allowed Volanti to present his poured concrete economy houses as appropriate for the tropical climate with their sun decks on top. And it gave Rosati a chance to promote Florida houses at Orange Lake Village as part of his Way of Life campaign, linking his models to easy living and a Florida lifestyle. The Florida house type was also flexible enough that aspects of it, particularly the Florida room, could be taken up by builders elsewhere. Yet the national reach of the concept did not reside so much in the fact that builders across the country adopted ideas directly from Florida builders. Rather, the concept of the Florida house gained national currency as the state became America's middle-class playground. Indeed, the national appeal of the Florida house is reflected in the growing number of vacationers and retirees that flocked to the state beginning in the immediate post-World War II period and continuing to the present for easy living Florida style. The story of the Florida house, with its origins in the immediate post-World War II decades, is thus a national story, one intimately linked with the growth of middle-class leisure, the rapid expansion of vacation and retirement benefits to an increasing number of Americans, and the post-war middle-class American dream. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We are going to open up for questions from the audience. So I'm getting a question for our speaker. Please let us know, and I will come over to you.
I lived in these houses, but then I probably like that. I've lived in a conflict which is just up the ways. And we had jalousie windows. And they fell out of favor at some point. And my sense is that that came with the proliferation of air conditioning. And I'm wondering if you had any comment on the windows. And then secondly, nowadays it seems that people in Florida refer to their outside houses as lanais.
Indeed.
And I've never heard of anything myself. I'm wondering if you could comment on that one.
Both excellent points. So the relationship to air conditioning is complicated, and I'd like to kick it to my colleague, architect Helen Schulman, who's written about this extensively. But we start seeing, and I've been through the Mackle archive in particular, we start seeing air conditioning coming in the early 1950s. At the same time, they were still using the jalousies. And to me, I would say that the reality of living in Florida as we all know, makes air conditioning required in the summer, at least by our contemporary standards. But to appeal to Northerners, there was still this idea of this tropical climate. And so to me, I don't know when the jalousies fell out of favor particularly, but I think it still was a marketing gimmick because it was this idea of bringing the outdoors in, which the fact that you could open windows in the winter, speaking as a Northerner, is very appealing. So I think it works in that context. And your other question?
Lanai's.
Lanai's. So this is part of that fabricated tropicality that I'm talking about. So it was one of these island ideas that was brought in. And it was less about accuracy per se, and more about this sort of generalized idea of a tropical, leisurely way of life, if that helps.
I just wanted to make a comment about the jealousy window.
Yes.
I'm working on also jealousy windows too, and I remember very much as someone who studied this material. It really had to do with it was a later problem. It was less related to air conditioning, because air conditioning became popular in the 60s. And the jealousy window doesn't really start falling out until we became concerned about sustainability.
Makes sense. Yep.
Really started changing out the jealousy.
Thank you.
Much later, like in the
70s,
but even later.
even later.
In the 70s, but really even later, people started. Then, people really started changing it into relevance about 15, 20 years ago.
I'm a retired lawyer from the north. You can't talk about Florida land without talking about fraud. I can tell you, I was a lawyer and represented people who had been the third or fourth or fifth purchaser of plots. And that was possible with $10 down because you see they didn't get a deed.
Right.
All they got was a promise to pay out. And what they used was a technique called fence posting. Anyway, that's very complicated, but there was lots of fallout.
Yeah.
Against Northerners because of these low down payments. They still have this problem in Miami with it's going a big scandal right now in some properties at $1 million each for the funds.
If I may comment, I appreciate this comment, and I have a lot to say about the development of Port Charlotte, which was actually Mackle built, but they were working with a development firm, a Canadian development firm that was actually notorious for what you're talking about. And the Mackles divested. They got out.
People that they use sales people who are not on.
Right.
Top north.
Right. So I think I would also add, since we are in Miami Beach, that has earlier origins as well, going back to the 20s boom, which was also speculative and full of fraud. I also want to draw attention to my colleague, Jason Veek. He has just published a book. I can't remember the title. It will come to me if you come here. That is on the $10 down, $10 a month scheme. It's a wonderful read. So I encourage you to look for that if you're interested.
Thank you for your talk. I have two questions. I have family members who are also builders and developers, so I sort of know how they think. Do you think the Lehman Brothers made a positive contribution to the development? In South Florida, and think that in all of your conversation, you ever mentioned like an urban plan in these large developments?
Both excellent questions. I have access to two wonderful family private archives, the Mackle Company Archive and also the Rosati Family Archive. Indeed, in talking with descendants, and I've done oral histories in one case, I believe that they thought they were being sincere in building for the masses. I fully believe in the ethics of that. This goes with the ideas of fraud, so it's complicated, right? The Mackles, in my opinion, are absolved. They were working with others who were they were doing the speculative work with the lot. So I absolve them of that. Are they good in the long term? This is a question that I wrestle with all the time as someone whose research focuses on post-World War II suburban development. It made homeownership possible for a growing population, and yet it created what is often maligned as the cookie cutter suburbs, right? It's not what we're preserving, although there's a movement to preserve some of these things now. Don't get me started. But anyway, like it's a two-sided point. I mean, you want more people to have the possibility of owning their home, but what kind of home do you want? That relates to your question on urban planning. These guys weren't planners. They did have architects that helped them plan. I think the best case of this is Marco Island, where an architect planned it from, an architect, not somebody in urban planning per se, planned it from start to finish. But they were very aware of ideas everywhere that had to do with green space, and sort of incorporating that. And I think you can see that at Marco Island to an extent. So the ones that I talked about, not urban planning, but aware of urban design more broadly. Great questions, thanks.
Thanks so much for your presentation. What happened to these places by the town and these developments going people? They held their home values and then do the concrete stand up to down? Or is it now, like, has it made it possible for other than first-time buyers to get into the market?
It has. Yeah, and it depends on the individual development, but I'll speak to two. One is Orange Lake Village in St. Petersburg. The other is Pompano Beach Highlands in Broward. Both have not been changed a lot. So from a preservation standpoint, they have integrity. They could be districts, shockingly, if someone wants to preserve these concrete things because the houses haven't been expanded. And they've largely turned over either to working class buyers, some cases low income housing, but not so much. So they have turned over and make it possible because of their small size for people to invest in them, which is really, really interesting. In terms of their preservation, they're remarkably preserved. It's funny, my nephew is a meteorologist he was with the National Hurricane Center, and when I told him I was going to Leisure City to look at the poured concrete sun deck homes, he's like, oh, everything's gone down there in Homestead, you'll find nothing. There are those poured concrete houses with the little sun decks on top of them. Fine. So Volante had it right. He built them pretty sturdy. And you all know more than I do about hurricanes, but it did actually survive.
The demographic difference now?
It is. Very much so. So I don't work on contemporary, but new developments have been built for more affluent populations. So now they've largely sort of turned over, and are mainly first-time buyers.
What about like Levittown on Madden?
It's still there. It's more complicated. It depends both on the areas and there are multiple Levittowns. So the one in Pennsylvania has turned over a bit more than I think the one in New York. It depends. And they've been expanded. And because it's more affordable to live there than it is in the city, I think the one in New York has largely stayed more middle class. Pennsylvania is a little more working class.
The important point out that the FHA down payment changed everything. Because after the war until the 70s, so there were no building codes or so things. You didn't have to have a minimum lot size. Then when people wanted a permanent home and mortgage and the FHA came in, everything got cleaned up. And you couldn't just down payment things, skinny down payment. They went away in favor of very small payments with FHA insurance and zoning codes and building codes.
And you could pay over the long term, 30 years. Yeah.
And then there were GI mortgages. But these were not second homes. We're talking about people who are there, permanent residents and working people.
I appreciate your talk. Can you discuss a little bit what you can read from the archives and NACL and the like about the land assembly costs, or the maybe marginal lands or wetlands that some of these builders might have chosen to build on in famously Black Florida?
Every time I give a talk, you guys are really reinforcing that I need to finish this book. So I have a chapter on that. land development is to me one of the most fascinating parts of this story, because it was state sanctioned support. I mean, the state was like, buy up the cheap land on the margins of cities. These places, Orange Lake Village, which is the one in St. Petersburg, was so far out of town. You know, you can look at aerials from the 1950s. It was like 20 miles from downtown St. Petersburg, which caused problems because they had to have service workers in the community mow the lawns, tend the community areas. They couldn't get there. So, but it was marginal land that had, in that case, it was high enough that they didn't have to fill it. In other cases, and I think Marco Island is probably the best example, you know, the Mackles would buy cheap land, but it had to be improved to an extraordinary cost. If you look at, and there's the Mackle private family archive, which I've used through Marco Island, and then a lot of the Marco Island stuff is in Marco Island. It's crazy the costs that they had to, both financial and time costs, to develop that land, because most of it was submerged. And your point about Florida being lax, really through 1970, the state was incentivizing reclaiming that swampland for development. Like it was, the state improvement bureau sold off the land to get it to be improved. So there were real issues there, so to speak, but it varied by the different cases. In some cases, it was high enough that it was just cheap land that you could just subdivide and go, or you had to pay the cost to do the fill and the dredging also for the canals.
There used to be a joke that in Texas they would say they discovered oil on my property, and in Florida they'd say they discovered land on my property.
My favorite, one of my favorite stories of working in Florida, again, non-Floridian here, was a series of lawsuits in St. Petersburg in the 1950s by people whose water views kept being destroyed by people building houses on new land in front of their water view. And there was like a series in this one part of on Tampa Bay.
Around Miami, sometimes you see some older homes that they were built on daytime lighting in Providence style with a porch in the front, and they almost look like they're finding a way to sign the pyramidal 2 columns in the front. Can you tell about that?
I can't. I should probably look at them, because my other hobby, as someone in this room knows, is Frank Lloyd Wright. So I don't know, and I need to spend some time with that. Thank you.
The infrastructure cost of creating these villages and these developments, was it in your view borne totally by the developers and people purchasing, or did some of the incumbent cities around the area have absorbed some of those costs?
Great question. Thank you. You might know my editor who's asking me the same question. For the most part, builders absorbed it, the developers absorbed it, which is astonishing if you think about not only the land development costs, the dredge and fill, but also the water, the sewer, the electricity. If the developers were bearing that cost, they had to sell many, many, many lots at $10 down, $10 a month to make it work. And yet they did that and more. I mean, they made tons of money. So it's pretty astonishing. In a few cases in St. Petersburg, Pinellas County would absorb some of those costs for Rosati, for example. But for the Mackles, they were largely doing it on their own. And some of it also was that they wanted to do it their own way. The Mackles, to their credit, were very concerned about sanitary sewer systems that they wanted to manage on their own. So as not to damage, this is in Marco Island, so as not to damage the environment there. They were maligned for destroying Marco Island, but they were very careful about it. So some of it was that they wanted to do that development themselves.
On top of the cost of water and sewer, were most of these homes on septic tanks, or were they actually construct sewer systems?
Great question. They were far out, but I am just going through my brain. All were sewer, even Key Biscayne, which was Mackle's first, arguably, development. For those of you that don't know, and I'm going to probably get thrown at me, you're going to think I'm wrong, Key Biscayne was developed with these small houses originally by the Mackles. I know it's not like that. Okay, good. I actually said that to someone. Yeah, I have too. But I told someone who owns a different kind of home at Key Biscayne, and she was like, "No way, you're wrong." So Key Biscayne had its own sewer system to the mainland very early.
Do we have any final questions? Okay. So thank you all very much for